tightening like a charred wreath. What is this thing, I thought, called death?
That acid taste of death came from a distant island in the Aegean Sea. The eruption of the volcano on Santorini was probably the biggest bang in history. Its devastating effects are thought to have wiped out the Minoan civilization of Crete. The exact date has always been in dispute. Could a tree 7,000 miles away provide the answer? Scientists now think that the volcano shot a plume of ash into the stratosphere, which spread as far as China and North America. The thick veil of dust blocked the sun, causing temperatures to plummet.
You can read me like a book. Open me up and take a look. History laid bare, a garland here, a crown there, plain as a pikestaff for all to see, each year jotted down by me, the state of the nation, an annual report in ever-decreasing circles, the wheels of fortune, the cycles of despair.
The Santorini frost ring made people realize that tree rings could date events in antiquity with incredible precision. But since the early 1960s, a group of tree scientists have been frustrated by the limitations imposed on their art by the age of the oldest living tree. They wanted a dating instrument that would go back much further. This man, Tom Harlan, spends his time combing groves for pieces of dead bristlecone that may be even older than you.
By taking cores and sections out of logs and dead trees, we can overlap our record and go further back in time. So here we have living trees just very close to 5,000 years old, but by utilizing the logs and snags and what we call remnants, just the fragments of wood that are lying on the ground, we go back to the year 6,700 BC, or 8,700 years ago, as a continuous record.
His technique is to slide together sequences of rings from wood of different ages until they line up. By 1969, the world had its first unbroken dating record, going back nearly 9,000 years. It was a perfect reference which could be used to check other dating systems. It arrived at a time when the complicated chemistry of carbon dating was found to be flawed. Carbon dating depended for its accuracy on there being a constant level of radioactive carbon in the atmosphere. However, in the 1960s, this was found not to be the case. Bristlecones came to the rescue. Scientists took wood of a known date and then subjected it to radiocarbon dating to see how far out it was. They discovered that could be out by as much as 1,000 years. Archaeology was turned on its head. Dates always assumed to be right were wrong. The leading theory of how European history evolved had to be revised. You see, we had all believed that the influence of the Eastern Mediterranean had radiated outwards to the barbaric north. We had thought Stonehenge was inspired by the sophisticated Mycenaeans of Greece. In fact, it turned out that Stonehenge was built long before. That's why you and your kin are known as the trees that rewrote history. While Europe was sliding into its dark age, you were entering middle age. When you were 3,500 years old, you may recall a great change in the White Mountains. The nomadic Paiute Indian hunters began putting down roots of their own.
About 1,300 years ago, so 500–600 years after the birth of Christ, we start to see a very different pattern where entire families or households would move up here to the highlands for many weeks or even a couple of months in the summer, and they spent a long time up here exploiting the environment much more intensively than they had during that earlier hunting pattern. And that suggests to us that things in the lowlands, where living conditions are generally a little easier in one sense, it's certainly warmer, must have been pushed to the point where all of a sudden these uplands became more worthwhile to exploit more intensively.
The rising population forced families to move up to 12,000 feet, where they established the highest settlements in America.
In most instances, we would have probably seen 1, 2, 3 families inhabiting one of these villages in any particular summer. Women probably would have spent a lot of their time collecting roots like bitterroot, Lewisia, and also the seeds of a lot of these grasses. It's hard to imagine when you look at them, the seeds are so tiny, but those two were collected and eaten, while men probably would have spent most of their time hunting in more distant areas for mountain sheep. None of us working in this area, doing archaeology in this area, had any suspicion until, about 12, 13 years ago, that people lived in these harsh uplands, in these kinds of settled permanent villages. We always suspected that a little bit of hunting would have been going on up here in the summer months, but we had no notion that this kind of intensive village occupation was occurring. Methuselah might have been a little bit worried at times as he watched people starting to use some of these ancient trees and ancient timber to build these houses, to stoke their fires, to build hunting fences and that sort of thing. So maybe even a little bit of anxiety.
Anxiety was soon to turn to terror, not only for you, Methuselah, but also for the Indians. The white man was coming. The white immigrant took his time getting to California. By the 1860s, the canyons around you were echoing to the sounds of rocks being crushed and sifted. Prospectors were searching for silver and gold. Some continue to this day. Alan Aitken has been working these hills for 40 years. He barely makes enough to pay his way.
There's knowledge and skill involved in prospecting, but there's always that element of chance. Since you can't really see underground, it could nevertheless fail, and no matter how poor something is, there is at least some possibility that it could turn out to be something great. So honestly, I'm sure I've spent a lot more than I've ever made, but I still have hope. There's always the odds that in enough time it's bound to pay off for you, you know. Whether it'll pay you back for all the time you spent at it is very doubtful, but But if you spend enough time at it, sooner or later you'll bound to find something good.
If one prospector hit pay dirt, thousands of others followed. Each time a seam of silver or gold was struck, they swarmed all over the mountain, staking their claim, greed being the human curse. The richest silver mine was called Cerro Gordo. In 1870, it supported a town of nearly 5,000 people, a wild and lawless place. Ex-Hollywood actress Jodie Stewart still lives in this ghost town.
This was an extremely violent town. There was a murder a week in Cerro Gordo. There are 600 people buried up on the hillside. The hanging tree is laying down canyon. We have one building, the Belshaw House, that has 156 bullet holes in the living room floor.
And Jodie knows how they got there.
Dance.
At night you would hear a little dance hall music and some gunfire, and you would hear rock hammers and drills striking into the hard rock, and probably an occasional black powdered explosion as somebody shot around. The atmosphere here was fairly Dante-esque. At first it was, I think, a small mining camp, but then with investment came the large smelters. I've read accounts where they called Cerro Gordo, which means Fat Hill, they called it Old Smoky. The smelters were belching smoke 24 hours a day. There were at least 2 large ones that were burning several cords a day, I guess probably maybe 10, 12 cords a day.
If I had lungs, I would be coughing. A throat, I would be parched. If I had eyes, they would be stinging. Flesh, it would be scorched. Sulfur, smoke, and cinders enfold me like a shroud. There is no silver lining, only poison in this cloud.
The smoke was a byproduct of the extraction of molten silver from the ore. At its height, the mine yielded 2,000 tons of silver a year.
Freighting silver bars was always a problem, and at one time the production from the hill was so great that between 18 and 30,000 of these 83-pound bars stacked up waiting shipment by wagon. And the workers were stacking the bars like bricks and stretching canvas over the top and living in them. So they were really living in silver houses.
But success for the human spelled disaster for the bristlecone. Wood was needed to fuel the smelters, to shore up mine shafts, and to build houses. For miles around you, the hills were stripped bare, the air filled with the silent chemical screams of dying trees. Your defenses were triggered. When bristlecone skin is broken, the needles release evil-smelling chemicals called terpenoids. These are highly effective against insect attack, but are useless against axes and saws. You were not the only victims. The Paiute Indians suffered a similar fate. Ranchers moved cattle into the valleys to feed the miners. The cattle ate the grass seeds that formed part of the Indian staple diet, and the miners hunted the longhorn sheep almost to extinction. The Indian way of life could no longer be sustained.
Toyo, toyo, quena, better say, yaga, yaga, ke, yaga, yaga, ke, yaga, yaga.
The Paiute Indians, who had lived alongside you for over 1,000 years, were swept from the valleys within half a decade. Yet these mining towns were never more than a flash in the pan. The town of Rhyolite boomed for 7 years, boasting banks, swimming pools,